Good morning, brothers and sisters. I hope that you are doing well this morning. I look forward to seeing y'all in a little while. I'm actually recording this on Saturday night, so I guess it's morning for y'all, but evening for me, so that it takes a little while to upload things. This way I can make sure that I'm there with you guys on time tomorrow morning. I'm looking forward to being there with my family. This will be the first time that all of us have gotten to come to church together in quite some time. We're looking forward to being with you, to praying with you, to listening to David's excellent lesson and singing together in the morning. So look forward to seeing you all there. If instead of watching this early, you've gotten used to watching it in the afternoon or in the evening or at some other time of the week, we enjoyed seeing you and look forward to going through what we're doing this morning. What we are going to be focused on this morning, or this lesson, I should say, is we're going to be wrapping up the conclusion to the book of Kings. Now, after we're done with the text of the book of Kings, which we'll either finish it or leave a few verses off today, this time, is we're going to spend one or two classes reviewing. It's a long book, right? We've been in this study for a little while, and I think it can be useful to kind of try to recapture a lot of that for us. In the meantime, after that, I should say, after those one or two lessons, so probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we're going to be moving on then to another study. As I mentioned, we're going to be studying the books of 2nd Peter and Jude. I really look forward to studying those with you. It's not something that I've studied a lot for, so I'm kind of looking forward to kind of getting into some new things and reading some new things. I enjoy doing that. I look forward to being part of that study with you and hope that soon we can be meeting together for Bible classes physically together rather than just here online. So, with that in mind, let's think about where we're going to be going in the book of Kings here. Where we're at in the rest of the book of Kings is there's this huge shift and change in how the inspired author is writing about things. We are going to get a lot of really short stories of kings whose names sound the same and who don't reign for very long. A lot of times it's just 3 months, kind of like at the end of the Northern Kingdom. And these same short kind of staccato strokes and descriptions of these meaningless kings are meant to emphasize that God is going to destroy this people. These short little bitty episodes and lack of details and really monotonous sort of an approach is especially striking to us because we've just covered the past three kings in reverse, Josiah and Manasseh and Hezekiah, and even before then kings like Joash and others who've got a lot of information about them. These kings often have, right, 2 chapters or sometimes more just about them. And now we're going to get 3 verses here, 4 verses there, 5 verses there. And of that, a lot of it's kind of the boilerplate of kings. He was this person, he reigned this long, here was his mom, and he was good or he was bad. You know, that sort of stock imagery that we've been seeing so far. And although there's going to be a bunch of kings we're going to mention, this whole entire length of text only lasts 22 years. We're covering the time from Josiah's death in 609 BC until the destruction of Judah. Pardon me, I start recording and I start yawning. I don't know why that is, but it is just true. Until 687 BC. Sorry, 587 BC. I don't know why I wrote down 6 and then said it when I knew that was wrong. But 587 BC. And this time is going to just fly by because Judah doesn't have a chance. There is no chance for Judah because they will not repent. The prophet Jeremiah is really active during this time. And if you really want to kind of know more about it, I would strongly encourage you get a chance to read Jeremiah. Reading Jeremiah can be a little tough because it's not in chronological order. I will refer to some of that as we go through these sorts of things. But what we see focused on repeatedly is that another main reason, and we'll talk about this more next class, that Judah doesn't have a chance is because she keeps on relying on Egypt. And that never goes well. If you remember all the way back to the destruction of the northern kingdom in Second Kings chapter 17, or wrong chapter, sorry. If you remember what destroyed the northern kingdom, it was their reliance on Egypt. That was the death knell. When the Assyrians find out that they've sent letters trying to get Egypt on their side, that's what destroys them. And that same reliance on Egypt is what's going to destroy and be the death knell for the the southern kingdom then as well. So let's get started then. If we go over to 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 21, and we're going to read through verses 35 at this point. Now, Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah in the land of Hamath, so that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he laid on him the tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim the son of Josiah king in the place of Josiah his father. And he changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away, and he came to Egypt, and he died there. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, but he taxed the land to give the money according to the command of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give it to Pharaoh Necho. So what do we have going on here? We have this first king here that we're introduced to, Jehoahaz. And Jehoahaz is 23 years old when he begins to reign. He's the son of Josiah, and we think everything kind of is going to be going well in some ways, right? That at least you have one of Josiah's sons on the throne, even though Josiah died. But then he only reigns for 3 months. And he did what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and he may be his father's son, but he's not his father's son, if you know what I mean. And what we see in this time is that he does evil. And so Pharaoh Necho, who of course has destroyed and killed his father, comes and takes him away as well. He establishes a tribute, a really expensive tribute of 100 talents of silver. That's a lot of money. A talent of gold, that's a lot of money. And he goes and he changes who is king. He puts in a puppet king, someone who's going to support him, not someone who's going to fight for the Babylonians like his father had done, but he takes Eliakim and he puts him in the throne, and he extracts money that we read. Eliakim extracts the money from the people. But even though we'd say, oh, okay, well, he's got to get the money from somewhere, Jeremiah chapter 22, verses 13 through 17 emphasizes that this is a wicked extraction, because while he is bleeding the people of Judah dry, he is building himself a new palace. He's a lot like Solomon in that way, or he's a lot like the evil sons of Eli in that way, who are putting a burden on the people that they cannot bear, all the while doing nothing to alleviate it himself. And then after him, we have another king that's going to come back, or really it's kind of the additional information about Jehoiakim, and we're going to have a lot more, it's kind of a bad chapter division, but a lot more information about kind of what's going on there. So let's go ahead and turn over our Bibles, and read verses 36 through the first 7 verses of chapter 24. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebidah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all his fathers had done. In his days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. But then he turned and rebelled against him. And the Lord sent against him the bands of the Chaldeans, and the bands of the Syrians, and the bands of the Moabites, and the bands of the Ammonites, and sent against them to Judah to destroy it, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by his servants the prophets. Surely this came upon Judah at the command of the Lord, to remove them out of his sight for the sins of Manasseh, according to all that he had done, and also for the innocent blood that he had shed. For he had filled Jerusalem with innocent blood, and the Lord would not pardon them. Now the rest of the deeds of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and the Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place, and the king of Egypt did not come out again of the land. For the king of Babylon had taken all that had belonged to the kingdom of Egypt, from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So we have this new king, this Jehoiakim, right? Or Eliakim, if we wanted to know his old name. And he's 25 years old when he begins reigning. He's actually older than his brother who was reigning at first. And his story is merged with the story of his brother below, and he's going to rule for 11 years. But what we focus on is that he also does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. And this evil is going to bleed into the text that relates to his rebellion to Babylon. At first, of course, because the king of Egypt, Pharaoh Necho, has put him on the throne. He's pro-Egyptian. But then Jeremiah says that he kind of explains his evil. He says, listen, he actually threatens the good prophets in Jeremiah 26. He burns the scroll of God that God has provided to him. And we can tell that although he is Josiah's son, Josiah's reforms are dead. And remember what the prophet had told Josiah, that what Huldah had told Josiah, that even though I'm going to destroy Judah, you won't see it. You're going to be buried in peace. You want to see the chaos and the bloodshed and the rioting and the looting and the destruction that Babylon is going to come and that Judah is going to do. But here Jeremiah declares that Jehoiakim, according to Jeremiah, is going to receive, quote, a burial of a donkey. He's going to be dragged away and he's going to be thrown outside the gates. This is a far worse death. This is a death that we've seen the wickedest kings of Jerusalem and the wickedest kings of Israel getting. And this is the alternate to God's grace that he's given to Josiah. And we see that the reason that this happens is because, of course, ultimately because of his wickedness. And we read then that Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes there, and for 3 years he makes Jehoiakim his servant. And what that means is after 3 years here, that puts us there in 605 BC, and a big deal happened in 605 BC. And that is in 605 BC, the Egyptians and the Assyrians went up to go and fight Babylon at the Battle of Carchemish, and they get the floor wiped with them. And he swaps his loyalty to Babylon because Babylon is obviously stronger. Now, Nebuchadnezzar takes a big tribute from him because he doesn't really believe that he's kind of completely honest or really kind of dealing with this in that way or something. We don't exactly know. But what he also does is this is when he takes probably Daniel and his 3 friends to train them and make them into new rulers for the future. But after a little bit of time, Jehoiakim rebels because he thinks that again the shifting sands have changed. He thinks that when Nebuchadnezzar has gone down to invade Egypt, he actually has this temporary setback, and he thinks Egypt is strong again, but it's not. His rebellion has failed from the beginning. And we read in verse 2 through verse 4 exactly why it failed. That God takes these roving bands, these, kind of like what we see in the book of Judges, that these are not like armies. These are just roving bands of, Vikings or something like that, right? And they come from all these different peoples, and then they're the ones who come up against Jerusalem and Judah to destroy it. But it's really God who set them in motion, just because this is what God's prophets have said. And he says that the reason God is bringing destruction against this people, the reason that they're suffering, the reason these terrible things are happening to them is not because of, some what we might consider a major thing. Of course it is to God, and we should consider it a major thing. What does he say there in verse 4? But it's because of the innocent blood that had been shed, which the Lord would not pardon. Now this is a big deal. We've talked about this before. We've talked about when we discussed David. We talked about when we discussed Saul. We've talked about it before. In the Bible, the shedding of innocent blood is a cosmic offense. It offends God when innocent blood is shed. It is awful. It destroys the world. It messes everything up. If you remember in the Old Testament, there are even special laws that says if you find that there's been a murder and you cannot solve it, then you have to go through this whole big long ritual to try to expurgate the innocent blood. And here, instead of expurgating the innocent blood, if we read the prophet Habakkuk, who's active at the same time, then he says they don't care about justice. They don't care about any of these things. They've shed innocent blood and they're not doing anything about it. And Habakkuk prays that they do something about it. And God says, "Oh, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to bring the Babylonians. They're going to destroy everything." And Habakkuk's like, "No, that's not what I'm talking about. No, they're worse than we are. They're ungodly. They're unrighteous. They don't care about justice. They just want to destroy stuff." And God's like, "Yeah. Because you're not going to do anything, I'm going to do it for you. You either fix these things yourself, or I'm going to use the Babylonians, or here we see the Moabites and the Ammonites and the Syrians. I'm going to do it for you. You've got your chance. Use this as your wake-up call." Oh, but of course, the people don't do that, right? We know the end of the story. That's not what they do. And his son is going to rule in his place. Jehoiachin is going to rule in his place. And so we have the next king then brought forward there. And we're going to read these verses there, verses 8 through 17. Now Jehoiachin was 18 years old when he became king. And he reigned for 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Nehushta, the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father had done. And at that time the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city was besieged, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon himself, and his mother, and his servants, and his officials, and the palace officials. And the king of Babylon took him prisoner in the 8th year of his reign. And he carried off all the treasures of the temple, all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and cut into pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon, the king of Egypt, king of Israel, had made, just as the Lord had foretold. And he carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives and all the craftsmen and all the smiths, and none remained except for the poorest people of the land. And he carried away Jehoiachin to Babylon. The king's mother, the king's wives, the officials, the chief men of the city, took them into captivity from Jerusalem to Babylon. And the king of Babylon brought captive to Babylon all the men of valor, 7,000 of them, and the craftsmen and the metal workers, 1,000 of them, everyone who was strong and fit for war. And the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So here we have this new king, Jehoiachin. He's 18 years old when he begins to reign. He rules for 3 months just like his uncle. And he does what's evil in the eyes of the Lord. And Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon comes against him again, and the city is besieged, and he surrenders. And this is in 597/598 BC, or I should have said those in reverse. And what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes and says, "You guys have rebelled again. We're not doing this," right? Like here, and he takes away all the people who might be able to rebel. This is when Ezekiel, for example, probably is taken into captivity. And he doesn't just take the best of the people, he takes the best of everything. He loots the temple, he takes the treasures, he takes everything that Solomon put in, he takes everything that's in the king's house. He's fulfilling the words that Hezekiah said. Listen, Hezekiah, Isaiah said, right? Because you have been prideful, God's going to come and take away all this stuff. And that's what the Babylonians do, right? They come in, they come and they just take stuff. 10,000 people from the upper class, another 7,000 from the warrior class, probably the middle class of what we would consider. It's not really middle class. And only the poor remain. And he takes Mattaniah, an uncle, cousin, and he renames him Zedekiah, and he makes him king. And Zedekiah is king, and we read a relatively long reading, so we may break this into a few pieces. But Zedekiah was 22 years old when he became king. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. What do we have here? That we see that God has said, this is it. It's evil, evil, evil. You are done for. I'm going to cast you out of my presence. And it's at that point, right? That point of that presence, that evil, that wickedness, that we know, how is God going to do this? How is God going to destroy? Well, we read, Zedekiah rebelled against the kingdom of Babylon. That's the way that God's going to do this. And in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with all of his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And he built siege works all around it. So the city was besieged till the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine was so severe in the city that there was no food for the people of the land. And then a breach was made in the city walls. And all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, by the king's garden. And the Chaldeans were around the city, and they went in the direction of the Arabah. From the army of the Chaldeans pursued the king and overtook him on the plains of Jericho, and all of his army was scattered from him. And they captured the king, and they brought him to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And they passed sentence on him. And they slaughtered Zedekiah's sons before his eyes. And they put out the eyes of Zedekiah. And they bound him in chains. And then they took him to Babylon. This is a horrific story, a horrific sight. Zedekiah is 21 years old when he begins to reign. And he, like before, 11 years, 3 months, 11 years, we just keep saying that same sort of a thing. That he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord. Jeremiah chapter 21 says that one of the things that made Zedekiah so bad is he's wishy-washy. He wants God to save Jerusalem, but he's not really willing to commit to serving God. That he wants to inquire of God, but he also wants to inquire of all the other gods around them. In Jeremiah chapter 34, we see he's a man who listens to the prophets, but only does what they say when he wants to. We see that at first Jeremiah says, listen, if you will stop oppressing the poor, God will save Jerusalem. And he's like, okay. And he makes everybody free the poor. And then Babylon goes away for a little bit. And then he's like, never mind. I need to take these people as slaves, re-oppress the poor. And he takes them all right back and doing what he was. And God's like, well, this is what we're going to do. We're going to destroy you because of that. And that is what happens, right? He rebels against Babylon. That is not a good call. Jeremiah has been telling him, do not rebel against Babylon. Do not rebel against Babylon. Do not rebel against Babylon. But no one's going to listen to Jeremiah. So in the 9th year of his reign, he does that. And the siege lasts for about a month until everybody is out of food. He's been betrayed. He's trusted in Egypt, that broken staff, right? The Egypt is not strong enough to do anything. They might have been strong enough to kind of keep Babylon busy in their own land. Apparently, they've rebelled perhaps at this point. But the wall falls, they're out of food, it's bad, and the king says, we got to get out of here, we're going to try to escape. And you notice what kind of happened, right? He flees the city, he's captured in front of Jericho, and what happens? They capture him and they bring him before the king, and they systematically kill his son. It's right before his eyes. And you can imagine how horrific this is. I don't know if you've watched the news or the videos. I actually have just been hearing helicopters fly around outside my window because of some of the riots that have come about this, and the looting and the terrible things that have occurred because of that. But if you've seen any of the videos of George Floyd, him killed before your eyes, you can imagine how horrific a thing that is. And here, this is what happens to the king, that his sons are killed one by one in front of his eyes. And then, so that it's the last thing his eyes see, they put out his eyes so that image cannot be erased. And they're going to take him to Babylon, and he's going to die in exile. But the last thing his eyes see is the brutal, graphic murder of his children. What an awful, awful, awful thing. And yet the book of Kings says this because this is what you've been doing to other people. This is the oppression that you've been doing to other people. That's what the focus, if you read Habakkuk or if you read Jeremiah, right? If you read here, that's where this focus on this wickedness that the people are bringing out. They're sinning against God. They're sinning against that man made in His image. They're serving idols, right? They're oppressing everybody. It's an awful situation, and so it gets turned back on Him, and it's just hard to read. But we see that there's more going on there as well. It's not just this, as if that's not enough, right? That we read in the 5th month, the 7th month, that was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the bodyguard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. And all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. And the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon, together with the rest of the multitude, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. But the pillars of bronze that were in the house of the Lord, the stands of the bronze sea that were in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans, they broke them into pieces. They carried the bronze to Babylon, and they took away the pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the dishes and the incense and the vessels of bronze used in the temple service, and the fire pans and the bowls, and what was gold the captain of the guard took away as gold, and what was for silver he took as silver, and for the 2 pillars, the one sea, the stands that Solomon had made for the house of the Lord, the bronze of all these vessels that was beyond weight. And the height of the one pillar was 18 cubits, and on it was a capital of bronze. And the height of the capital was 3 cubits. And a lattice work of pomegranates, all of bronze, were all around the capital. And the second pillar had the same with lattice work. And they took them. And the capital of the guard, Sariah, the chief priest, and the Zephaniah, and the second priest, and the 3 keepers of the household. And from the city he took an officer who had been in command of the man of war, and 5 men of the king's council who were found in the city, and the secretary of the commander of the army who mustered the people of the land, and the 60 men of the people of the land, I guess we'll call them nobles, who were found in the city. And Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them, and he brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. And the king of Babylon struck them down, and he put them to death at Riblah and the land of Hamath, so that Judah was taken into exile out of its land. This is the destruction of so much of Judah's history. So much of everything that made Judah, Judah. The temple is burned down and looted. The walls were broke down. The palace is broke down. It's not just that he takes and he destroys the vessels of God. He takes and he destroys the people of God. Right? The nobles and counselors and the chief priests and the second chief priest, they're all taken and they're brought to Riblah just like the king was, and they're put to death. And Judah is dragged into exile. And the only thing that remains in Judah is the poorest people of the land, so that they can work the fields, so that Nebuchadnezzar can get something out of it. And we think, man, can this keep going? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. Because although there's not another king that we're going to read about, there's one more really, really important person that we are going to read about at the end of the book of Kings. And that's this governor, Gedaliah. And all the people who remained in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had left, he appointed Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, to be governor. Now, when all the captains and their men had heard that the king of Babylon had appointed Gedaliah governor, they came with their men to Gedaliah at Mizpah, namely Ishmael, son of Nethaniah, and Johanan, the son of Kareah, and Sariah, the son of Tanhumet, the Netopathite, and Jaazaniah, the son of the Maakathite. And Gedaliah swore to them and their men, saying, "Don't be afraid, because the Chaldean officials live in the land, serve the people of Babylon, and it will be well with you." But in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, the son of Elishama of the royal family, came with 10 men, and they struck down Gedaliah, and they put him to death, along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. And then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose, and they went to Egypt, because they were afraid of the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar thinks, okay, after this, no more kings for you guys, right? Like, it doesn't matter what king I've put in, you've been bad. And so he doesn't even pick a son of David. Gedaliah is from, he's the grandson of Josiah's secretary, Shaphan, who had gone to hold of the prophetess and said, hey, what do we need to do to try to save the nation? His father, according to Jeremiah chapter 26, is the one who'd intervened to save the prophet's life. And Jeremiah and Gedaliah have a pretty good relationship. Jeremiah chapter 40 prescribes him as someone who's willing to follow God and to serve Babylon. And we see in Kings there in verses 6 and 7 that he is doing the right thing, that Jeremiah says, listen, write a letter to the exiles, say, plant houses and build gardens, plant houses, build gardens, build houses and plant gardens. Sorry about that. Seek the peace of the city because you're going to be there a while. And this is the same message that Jeremiah has given Gedaliah here. He says, listen, don't be afraid of the Babylonians. Dwell in peace with them. This is the new thing. Do not rebel against them. This is God's plan. God has given them authority over you for right now. But this guy Ishmael, who seems to be the royal family, seems to think, well, why is this guy king and prince over us? Why shouldn't I be the person who's in charge? Why shouldn't I be the guy who's in power? Maybe he doesn't like his policies. Maybe he doesn't like his politics. Maybe he wants to rebel. We don't exactly know. But what we do know is they make a conspiracy and they kill off Gedaliah. And Gedaliah was the only thing keeping Judah in any sort of stability whatsoever. What do? They flee and they go to Egypt. They flee and they go to Egypt. We've seen Egypt over and over and over. And one thing that if you want, you don't have to do this, but if you're interested for next week that might be helpful or could be useful, is just kind of skim through again the books of Kings or some of your favorite stories if you've been meaning to read through some of those things. And notice all of the Egypt language that we have, all of the language of Exodus, all the language of Egypt, all the language of Pharaohs. It's all over the book of Kings. And that's because in Deuteronomy, and remember the book of Kings is really based on Deuteronomy in a lot of ways, it says don't ever go back to Egypt. Every time in the Bible the people turn to Egypt, they are destroyed. It doesn't matter if it's in the time of the patriarchs. It doesn't matter if it's in the time of Judges. It doesn't matter if it's in the time of the book of Kings. It doesn't matter if it's in the Exodus. God says, look, you either trust Egypt or you trust me. Which one do these people trust? Clearly they trusted in Egypt. And when we read that, everything seems to be for naught. Everything seems to be hopeless and helpless. I mean, think about what Judah's situation here is at the end of their story. The book of Kings ends in terror and terribleness. I mean, this is bad stuff, right? You have the king Gedaliah and, not the king Gedaliah. You have the king Zedekiah who's drug out and his sons are killed one by one before his eyes and his eyes are gouged out. And it's not just terrible because it's gruesome. It's not just terrible because it's horrible to consider. It's terrible for an even bigger reason. And that is, it is terrible because if all of his sons are dead, where is the next king going to come from? In other words, remember God's promises back in 2 Kings chapter 7? Remember God said there's going to always be a son of David on the throne? Well, it's not just that there's not a throne now, because the temple and the palace and everything that God has given has been destroyed, right? That the temple, they were like, oh, if you go to the temple and pray, then God's going to forgive you. Well, that's going to be hard to do without a temple. Well, what about God's promises to David, right? Like, there's always going to be a son of your throne. Well, there's no nation, and there's no son, and there's no king, and this is it, right? Like, they wonder, has God failed? If you read, some of the Psalms, 89 or 90 or a few others, right? The psalmist says, God, have you lied to us? How long are we going to have to deal with this? This is not this is not what you promised, God, and we're holding you to account. Has God's word failed? Is this the end of the story? Is this it? It's like, okay, it's been a nice run, guys. The kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel had lasted for this long, but sorry, that's it. No more, sorry, y'all were just too wicked. Has God cut off his people because they were so wicked? Has God destroyed them because of that? And with all of that in our mind, and we really have to have all that in our mind, the ideas of the pain and the destruction and the wickedness and the destruction and the fear and all the people aren't even living in their homeland anymore. They've been shipped and carted off to live in Babylon. And I think it's hard for us to realize and think about how that would be, especially if we've kind of always lived close to home. But imagine getting taken from your home or I don't know, make up some kind of crazy story. It's like China has come in and they've defeated the U.S., and now we're going to live in Wuhan or something. We don't speak the language. We don't know the people. Everybody hates us there. We don't belong. What's happened? Do we have hope? Are we hopeless? Because that's what the people in the book of Kings in exile were feeling. Hopeless, abandoned, alone. But that's not how the book of Kings ends. The book of Kings ends with an epilogue. And it says in verses 27 through 30, and then the 37th year of the exile, 37 years later, halfway through what it's going to be, Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign on his ascension year, graciously freed Jehoiachin, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him, and he gave him a seat above the kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put off his prison garments, and every day of his life he dined regularly at the king's table. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, according to his daily needs, as long as he lived. And that's how the book of Kings ends. And we've talked about this before, but the book of Kings is an intensely messianic book. And what I mean by that is it's longing for the new David, the new King of David. It's longing for Jesus, although he doesn't, of course, the writer, the inspired writer of the book of Kings doesn't even know who Jesus is or really what's about, but he knows what he needs him to be. And so the book of Kings ends with a note of hope. It's not a symphony of hope. It's not trumpets blaring that says, hey, here's David. Here's God's promises fulfilled. Here's everything we've been waiting for. Here's Jesus right in front of us doing. It's not what it is. It's a seed of hope. It says there is still a Davidic king alive, and he can have children. And there's a promise that remains. There is an opportunity. There is a possibility. It is a seed of hope. But you remember, of course, what did Jesus say about tiny seeds? He says, of course, that faith is like a mustard seed. Hope is like a mustard seed. Trust in God is like a mustard seed. That although it is one of the smallest seeds we can imagine, it turns into this enormous plant. And that seed of hope here in the book of Kings longs for that same fruition in the presence of Jesus Christ. And I think that hope in the middle of helplessness is something that we all should remember. It's going to be something, of course, that we'll see in the lament psalms. If you've been reading that psalm every day, as I have, and really I think been enjoying finding that helpful, even not necessarily enjoying it, but we see that hope is where the book of Kings ends. And we'll talk about that more next time. But I hope that you're having a good day. I look forward to seeing you, to singing with you, and to having more opportunities to be with you in person soon. Have a blessed day.